Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan and the Center for the Jewish Future, we'd like to welcome all of you to today's Daf Yomi Siyum. The Pachad Yitzchak in Maimer Nun Zayin on Sukkos uncharacteristically records a story of two students of the Chidushei Harim who were dancing on Simchas Torah. And the Chidushei Harim commented that one of the students would tire before the other. The students were mystified. How can you tell? How can you measure their endurance simply by virtue of their dancing at this very moment? And the Chidushei Harim explained, "Ha'echad rochad mikoach simchas haTorah shelomad be'ogar ad achshav." One of them is dancing, animated by their simchas haTorah, based upon their learning that they have studied until this point. Ve'ilu hasheni rochad mikoach simchas kavos haTorah. Rather, the other one is dancing as a result of the Simchas HaTorah, Al Kol Osa Torah She'Yomi Be'asi, regarding all of the Torah that he ultimately will accomplish. The Vadai Shel Torah Shekvar Lomad, certainly when it comes to the Torah we have learned, Afilu Yerav Me'or, even if it's a great and significant and substantive amount of Torah, Yesh Lo Givul, there is a certain finality to it. Aval Torah She'Yomi Be'asi. But the Torah that we ultimately devote ourselves to learning in the future, it is as great as the sea. There is a difference between dancing based on what we've learned and dancing in anticipation and aspiration for what we hope to accomplish. We gather today to celebrate not only a Siyum of the Talmud Torah that so many in this room and so many who are watching with us online have accomplished up until now, but we also commit ourselves to the growth in Talmud Torah, to the aspirations and the dreams of accomplishing further, that open the reservoirs of passion and energy for one's dedication to growth in Limud HaTorah. And it is so fitting that we do so together today in our yeshiva. A yeshiva with such a glorious past of such great gedolim, of such incredible contributions to the spiritual vitality of the larger Jewish community, but a yeshiva that continues to produce the most learned and passionate and inspirational talmidim, and future leaders that will ultimately define our community. Under the brilliant and creative leadership of Rav Menachem Penner, the Dean of our Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, together with all of the incredibly illustrious and accomplished Rosh Yeshiva, our yeshiva continues to animate the broader Torah world with an unparalleled level of scholarship and Simchas HaTorah. And so today we will dance together not only our own Simchas HaTorah. We dance not only for Seder Moed, but we dance for Seder Nezikin as well. We dance not only for what we have learned, but we dance for the aspirations and the dreams for what we hope to accomplish. Mazel tov to all who have joined us today. We may all have the schus to join together on Wednesday, June 1st, 2015, on the Israel campus of Yeshiva University for our Siyum on Seder Nashim. At this time, it is a great kavod for me to introduce our Rosh Shachter, our Rosh Yeshiva, our Rosh Kollel, a giant in Torah leadership throughout our community, to share with us the final words of Maseches Chagiga and Seder Moed. Rosh Shachter.
Shaking the head an institution of Nami Ha'aretz seems to correspond roughly to conservative and reform Jews. Not exactly. Some sort of discuss to what extent did it carry this over. So the Mishnah says that the Nami Ha'aretz will Hashvim al Maisis, and on Shabbos, if the Ha'aretz tells you that if the Maisis, that then you're about to rely on it. But whatever is left over on the Shabbos, you have to be Maisis. All HaPashas Maisis was only a chomer. We assume that the Rova Haaretz are mastering. Here also the Mishnah is at the end of Chagiga that the Am Haaretz, Chashudim ala Tumah also, not careful about Tumah, not 100% careful on Tumah V'Kara. So if they would touch the Kelim, if they some Mikdosh, the Kelim would become done. Anything they would touch, if you touch them, you would become done. So the Mishnah says that Baregel, we treat all of the Am Haaretz as Chaverim. We say that they're not Tumah. But whatever came, let's say there were Kohanim who were Amiharetz, so they came, everybody came on Yom Tov, and everybody's making Korbanos, and everybody's touching all the Kelim. So whatever Kelim the Kohanim touched on the Regel, so on Regel we leave it, but after Yom Tov is over, just like after Shabbos is over, we go back to the din, we have to be makish, Meiser on what they said was the Meiser already. On Shabbos we can eat, so also the Regel, we rely on them, but if the Regel is over, then we have to be told all the Kelim. So the Mishnah has that they had backups, they had second and third copies of all of this, all of the Kelim. So whenever a Kli would be kept on, they would have to be total in the mikveh. So then they had the second one. If the two would be done, they would put the third one in. So the Mishnah mentions the top of Chabot, and the Mishnah mentions that the Shulchan, the Beis HaMikdash is the Kabul Tumah, the Tumah is Bachar, the Mizbach HaNechoshes, the outside is the Mizbach HaTorah, the inside is the Anach HaKabul Tumah. The Gemara is in the middle of discussing in Chabot and the Beis, and the whole discussion, why is the Mizbach, why is the Shulchan the Kabul Tumah? The Shulchan is made from wood, and we have a Klal Kuliyet, so also the Nachas, if you have a heavy, you have an Aron Kodesh, it's on Kodesh attached to the wall, you can't move it. But if you have a wooden Aron Kodesh that you can move, but it's very heavy, so usually you let it sit in one place, you don't have the wheels on the bottom. So the Gemara says that a Kliyet, so also the Nachas, is not the Kabul Tumah. So the Gemara says the Shulchan was a big heavy piece of furniture, and it sat there the whole year, nobody ever moved it, so why was it in the Kabul Tumah? The Gemara came up with a whole Chiddush that on Shalosh Regalim is to pick up the Shulchan and squeeze the Lechem HaBokim and show everybody, look how fresh it is, that it's still warm and it didn't become stale, even though it's sitting on the Shulchan for the whole week. It was a miracle. They quote the Stechebet quotes a letter from Shlomo Lazulman. Where did they get this Einfall from? You should squeeze the Lechem HaBokim and show everybody. So he said it's based on the Pasuk that the Gemara quotes on the first daf from Chabik, Yirei Yeroy, Kederach Shabbat Leiros, Kach Bal Liros. The people are supposed to be oil regel, that the Baruch Shalom should see them. We're supposed to see the Baruch Shalom most. How can you see the Baruch Shalom? Saying, look, he doesn't have a body. So that's what they used to demonstrate in Nisan Tedirim. They used to show something that indicates that there is a Hashras Hashchina. They used to show this. So the Gemara says the reason why the Shulchan is Makabel Tumah, even though it's a Kliyet, so Asir V'Nachas, but it's not Asir V'Nachas. The Shulchan should come, they would pick it up and move it to show there we go. So the Gemara is very Takasha. Why would you have to give that reason? That on Shalosh Regalim, they would pick it up. Why don't you just say that it's Mitzvah Zohar? It's Mitzvah Zohar. The whole thing is coated with metal. So Kli Mateches is Makabel Tumah, even if it is Asir V'Nachas. So the Gemara answers on the last line of Chavot of the base. Says that the shiny Shulchan, Ramad Karyeh, a pasuk in the Chesed, even though the Shulchan was quoted with the Zohar, is considered clear. What's the pasuk? So we quote the top line of Hazan. Quote the pasuk in the Chesed. It talks about the Mizbech. It said, the Mizbech ate Shovish Ames, Gavoya, the Orka Shtayim Ames, and the Mitzvah Gloy, the Orka Vikiros and Beis. The Gabbai Lai Zeh HaShulchan Hashem B'fnei Hashem. So the Pasuk speaks about the Shulchan and the Mizbeach and he calls it Eitz. You see that even though it's Mitzvah Zohar, it's considered Eitz. Then the Gemara asks the question, but is that still in the Pasuk itself? It starts off by the Pasuk and Mizbeach, you see in the Shulchan, the two different kelim. And the Gemara, Abiyach and the Shlokish, Am Chabayu, the bunch of Pasuk is talking about two kelim. But it's Merame is another thing. This bunch of this, Amikushkai, Mizbeach, Mechaber Allah Adam, person brings Karbonis, he gets an atonement for his sins, Achshav. After the Churban Beis HaMikdash, Shulchan Shel Adam Mechaper Allah. What do you mean Shulchan Shel Adam? So we're actually doing Pashup Pshat that you give tzedakah, you mach Misorchem to eat on your table. So tzedakah tatzim umam, tzedakah serves as a kappa. Obviously Shulchan Shel Adam, you go converting in the middle of the meal. Rashi says that it means that you give tzedakah. The Mishnah, so the Gemara explains again why the Shulchan wasn't Kabul Tumah. Then the Mishnah states that the tomb is bachas from the Mizbech HaChitzon and the Mizbech HaPnimi were not in the Kabul Tumah, so there was never any problem of the Kohanim Amharetz touching the Mizbech. So why is it that it's not in the Kabul Tumah? So the Mishnah says, Kli, there are only four categories of things that are in the Kabul Tumah, other than Kev, Malachim, and Mashkin. So it's only considered a Kli if it's not Mechubel Karka. If something is Mechubel Karka, it's not called a Kli. See, this Aron Kodesh is attached to the wall. The Gemara talks about a wooden Aron Kodesh that's not attached to the wall, even though it should have been a Kli, but it's a Kli, it's also the Nachas. It's still, that's why it's not Mechubel. If it's not Mechubel, it's not a Kli at all. The Mechubel is not a Kli. So the Mishnah says that both the Mizbach HaMechoshes, the outside Mizbach, the Mizbach HaZor, the Mizbach HaToros, inside Mizbach, are both not Mechubel. So the Gemara says, how do you know where would they call the Mishnah Kikarka? So the Gemara explains Mizbach HaMechoshes, it's Mizbach HaZor. The Mizbach HaMechoshes, the outside Mizbach was filled in with offers. So it was Mamish B'chubel Karka. It was B'chubel Karka. I know Mizbach HaZor, the Mizbach HaToros wasn't clean. It wasn't clean. The Gemara has in Tzvachim. You're going to get a different deal, a major difference between Mizbach HaNechoshes and Mizbach HaZor. Mizbach HaZor wasn't clean. So what does the Mishnah say? That they're both not Mekabel Tumah because they're both Karka. The Mizbach HaChitz, the Mizbach HaOilo is Mekubel Karka. So the Gemara ends it, the Mizbach HaZor Nechziv HaMenorah HaMizbachos. Plus it puts them both together. This Kish Mitzvah is there. You have a hekesh between the Mizbech HaChitz and the Mizbech HaPnim. So despite the fact that the Mizbech HaPnim really was a Kli, nonetheless, since the Pasuk has a hekesh compares the two, but just like the Mizbech HaChitz and is not Mekabel Tumah because it's Mamish Mechubel Karka and Mechubel Karka. The floor is considered, the top of the Mizbech is considered the Karka, not the floor underneath. As opposed to the Mizbech HaToros, the floor in the Beis HaMikdash, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, is the floor. The Karka is the floor, the top of the Mizbech is the top of the Kli. But nonetheless, because there's a hekesh, so it's also not Mekabel Tumah. Once the Gemara mentioned in Sicht ends off with the Mizbech, so the Gemara is going to have an Agadata about the Mizbech. So before you get to the Agadata about the Mizbech, we didn't finish it, okay. Agadata is going to come a little late. The Mishnah quotes, Reb Lezer says the reason why the Mizbech is not Mekabel Tumah is because Mishnah ain't Kikarka, Dib Reb Lezer. That's why it's not Mekabel Tumah. The reason why it's not Mekabel Tumah, the Mishnah says because they're coated with metal. The Mizbech HaChitza is coated with Nechoshes, the Mizbech HaPnim is coated with Zor. So the Gemara has the kasha, Adarabah. The Mitzvah, the Mateches is the reason why it should be Mekabel Tumah. It's not. They're giving it, they're disagreeing with Reb Lezer. Lezer says that it's not Mekabel Tumah because it's Karka. Mechubel of Karka, it's not Mekabel Tumah, it's not called the Kli. They're explaining why it is Mekabel Tumah. So it doesn't read straight to the Mishnah. It sounds like they're giving another reason why it's not Mekabel Tumah. Very more Adarabah. The Talmud should, that's the reason why it should be considered a Kli Mateches, and Kli Mateches should be Mekabel Tumah. And in Mar Ema, maybe you should correct the Girs in the Mishnah. You should read the Chachamim the Talmud. They disagree with Reb Lezer. They say that it is Mekabel Tumah because it's a Kli Mateches. That's the first suggestion. There's a mistake in the Mishnah. What you're saying, or perhaps there's no mistake in the Mishnah. Perhaps the Chachamim don't disagree with Reb Lezer. They both agree the same thing, that both Mizbachos are not Mekabel Tumah. But they disagree with the reasoning that Reb Lezer did. Reb Lezer says, you read in the Quran, the Parshas Truma Tetzaveh, so the Mizbech HaChitz and Mizbech HaPnim, they're both made from wood. They're both coated with metal. So, L'chayret, it should be a Kli Eitz, it should be a Kli Eitz. Also, they never moved the Mizbech. They used to pick up the shulchan and squeeze the left mapot and show the others up. They never picked up the Mizbech, the gigantic. So why don't you just say the Mizbech is not Mekabel Tumah because it's a Kli Eitz. Also, the Nachas, it sits there, it doesn't move. So the Lezer didn't give that reason, he gave a different reason. He gave the reason because you have a pasuk that the Mizbech HaChitza is removed of the offer, Mizbech HaTomer Taseli, Mizbech HaPnim is Hukash. So the Chachamim disagreed with Reb Lezer. What did he have to give this reason for? Why didn't he just say that it's a Kli Eitz also the Nachas? So perhaps the reason why he didn't give that answer is because he holds with Nesha and Mitzupin because it's coated with metal and a Kli Mateches, even if it sits, even if it doesn't move around, is Mekabel Tumah. So the Chachamim argued the Direm Derabbanakov, the Direm Derab Lezer argued. My diagram, why do you have to come out to a new reason that it's a posik, that it's Adom, and that Iskish Lahadodi? Why were you concerned in the first place? Why don't you just say, please, the reason why Reb Lezer held there's a problem, Shum de Mitzupin. So the Chachamim disagreed. You don't have to worry, you don't need any psukim. Live the Balta Tzipli and Gabai. No. The Tzipli is only very thin, and the bulk of the Mizbeach is eitz. The whole thing is eitz. So if the klei tzos and menachas, that's why it's not mekabel. According to the second suggestion, the Gemara, the Chachamim are not disagreeing halacha l'maisa with Reb Lezer. Those are the both Mizbachas and not mekabel. They just told Reb Lezer, you have to work so hard to explain why it's not mekabel. It's simply the klei tzos and menachas, and the tzipah is bottle the eitz, and it's called the klei. It's not mekabel. So because the Mesich, the Mishnah ends off that Mizbachas, we must going to have a little agat. The Gemara gives a hakdam, but an agat to the final agat. Amar Rabba, Amar Rabbaza, Talmid HaChamim, people who are Rishoyim, we assume go to Gehenna. In Gehenna, there's some kind of fire, so the fire is burnt. What if a person is a Talmid Chacham, he learned Daf Yomi, and he does another, if such a thing is conceivable. A person learned does another. So he says, Achidish, Ein Pur Shal Gehenna Shal Levis Behem. The two words in Hebrew, Or is light and Pur is fire. So it says, Ein Pur Shal Gehenna Shal Levis Behem. If a Talmid Chacham does an Avera, he deserves to be punished. He'll be put into Gehenna also, but he won't get burnt up. He won't turn into ashes. He'll suffer from the heat, but he won't get turned into ashes. How do you know? So he says, Kalvachamim is Salamandru. They thought that there was some kind of animal. Masalamandru should told us Eshu. Somehow they felt this animal comes into existence from a fire. Asat Nidam Einu Sholet this, but if a person smears his body with the blood of this salamander, he will not be burned by the fire. He'll get hot, but he won't be burned. He won't turn into ashes. So the other Talmid Chacham who talks a lot of different terms, so his whole body turns into like a heftish flesh. So the Talmid Chacham, he will suffer again, but he won't be burnt. He won't turn into ashes. Reish Lakish, what does it have to do with Mizbeach? The next agat that has to do with Mizbeach. Reish Lakish, in Rosh HaGehem Sholet is B'Pashi Yisrael, Habachayim B'Mizbach Hazor. The Medrash says, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the Medrash, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, make a wood Mizbeach, and then put a little bit of gold coating on top. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, it's going to burn when you have a fire on top. The fire is going to cause, it's going to be so hot. The wood of the Mizbeach is going to burn, and the gold on it, the gold coating on the top is also going to burn. How can I do that? So the miracle occurred that it never burned. The wood of the Mizbeach never burned, and the metal also didn't diminish. It was a nest. So that's what the Reish Lakish makes a Talmid Chacham. Mizbeach Hazor, Shein Or Vel Vidin Zohar. Kamasham, for so many years, hundreds of years, Ein Rosh this bow, a miracle occurred. It never got consumed by the fire. But she Yisrael, Shemalei Mitzvahs Karima, B'Tziv. Says in Shir Hashem, Ketavach Harim HaKoseh, and the Chacham had a tradition of HaKoseh, an additional level of interpretation. That's not the Pashut Shah. Additional level of interpretation. I think for HaKoseh, how the Rekwayim should give, Ha'achas Kam Le'Kam. The Pashut will discuss over here. What do you mean? If he's B'Lei Mitzvahs Karima, so why is he called Pashi Yisrael? The problem, what are we talking about over here? That's a tradition, Chazal. Some say that the Rimon has 613 seats. They say that I never thought captain, they said it's not true. I never counted. They told me his wife got upset, why did he waste time counting how many seats there were in the week? So the Imam makes his Kalachayim that Pashi Yisrael, even though they'll suffer in Gehenna, the Ein Rosh Sholet is going because they're full of mitzvahs, and the mitzvahs will protect them.
Thank you so much for the chapter. It's now a great privilege for us to call upon one of the Talmidim of our yeshiva who themselves have become a treasured Rav and an incredible Marbitz Torah, Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, who is the Magid Shir on our YU Torah site, one of the most popular Daf Yomi Shiurim with his signature clarity and insight, who also is a program director in Magid Shir in DRS High School, and of course the Rav of the Beis Knesset of North Woodley.
Shus Marinu Rabbeinu Harabavan Rav Shafter Shlita Avimori Maranan Rabbanan Rabosa The Medrash tells us, Rabbi Mani Pasach, when Rabbi Mani would teach the halachos of Daled Minim, he would start with a pasuk. Kol atzmosei tamarna Hashem mi chamocha. That all of my bones call out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is like you. Lo nemar pasuk zeh ela b'shvil lulav. And he would darshan that this pasuk is really about the Daled Minim shebalulav. Hashidra shalulav doma l'shidra shaladam. The spine of the lulav is like the spine of a human being. V'ahadas doma la'ayin. The hadasim are shaped like eyes. V'arava doma l'peh. And the arava is like a mouth. V'esrog doma l'lev. And the esrog is like a heart. Amar David, ein b'kol ha'evarim gadol me'elu. Shehin shkulim k'neged kol ha'huf. Habe kol atzmosei tamarna. That when you put these limbs together, these are the most important parts of a person's body that make up the majority of his body, and therefore, when we take Daled Minim, we are expressing our commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with our entire bodies. And of course, when we sit in Sukkah, we are also committing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with our entire bodies. Our entire bodies have to fit in the Sukkah. In fact, even the most minimalist view of the Shir Sukkah is Rosh Hashanah Shalom. It's the 6 tefachim by 6 tefachim that a person occupies with his entire body. So it would seem that the highest level mitzvah a person can do is the kind of mitzvahs that we're going to be doing in a few days from now. The mitzvahs of Daled Minim and of Sukkah, where we literally give it our all. Our entire physical being is designated to fulfill those mitzvahs. But there is one mitzvah that's so powerful that we exceed our physical limits in performing this mitzvah. And that's, of course, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Ein divrei Torah niskayim ela b'mi shememis atzmo aleha. That a person, in a certain sense, accomplishes Talmud Torah when he kills himself over it, meaning he goes beyond his physical boundaries, beyond what he would really be able to dedicate to Talmud Torah. There's a minhag Yisrael that when we sing in a week and a half from now, Moshe Emes V'so Raso Emes, that people, usually younger people, but people jump up and down. And the jumping represents an irrepressible excitement. We're jumping out of our skin as if to indicate that our neshamos are jumping out of our bodies with the kedusha of the Torah. There's a minhag even in Eretz Yisrael to do what they call hakafos shniyos. Very odd thing. After the Yom Tov is over, the celebration somehow continues. And maybe that continued celebration represents the unlimited sense of Torah as well. When Sukkot is over, we put away our Sukkah, we put away our Daled Minim, and even if we don't put away our Sukkah till Chanukah time, we don't sit in it. When Pesach is over, we put away the matzah. When Rosh Hashanah is over, we put away the shofar. But when Simchas Torah is over, we're just beginning to celebrate with the Torah. What better day to celebrate a Siyum than the day after receiving Luchos Shniyos, and during that brief time period when Klal Yisrael is totally engaged in preparations for mitzvahs. We remind ourselves this morning that the mitzvah that remains Keneged Kulam is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The Daf Yomi reminds us that the times for many other mitzvahs can come and go, but Talmud Torah is there each and every day. Talmud Torah is our oxygen, it's our breakfast, it's our lunch, it's our supper. It's what keeps us going each and every day. It's so appropriate that we make a siyum with the word hadron alef, return to us, or will return to you, indicating not only how our past learning has prepared us for a more effective and thorough future learning, but how we never say goodbye to the Torah. We're constantly engaged in Torah. We should all feel a profound sense of Hakaras HaTov, to our outstanding Rebbeim. Shavtim is here today. Feldman, Penner, many of the other Rebbeim were Yitzchak and Blau. Forgive me for not mentioning everyone, didn't get a chance to see who's here. But a profound sense of Hakaras HaTov. Our Rebbeim taught us to learn and to love Torah, modeled the role that Torah Hashem should play in the life of a Jew, and are constant sources of inspiration to their Talmidim, new and old alike. Our Hakaras HaTov extends, of course, to the Marcus and Adina Katz Vayu Torah that enables people, myself included, to learn Torah wherever we go. Enables us to be marmitz Torah in ways that were previously unimagined. Enables us to remain connected to our Rebbeim, the Bali Abasara, who serve as our link to our Sinai. And of course, we have to recognize the thousands of people who, though they are extraordinarily busy in their personal and professional lives, dedicate the time and energy to learning Torah on a high level, and are celebrating a significant accomplishment. The Siyum on the entire Seder Moed this morning. Just like they were Zocha to finish Seder Moed, they should continue with a renewed vigor to face the challenges of Yevamos and all that Seder Nashim has to offer, and we should continue to celebrate many Siyum. Shefta mentioned the last Gemara in Maseches Chagiga tells us that even the Amei Haaretz, even the Poshe Yisrael rather, are malay in mitzvos karimon, are full of mitzvos like a pomegranate. A little bit of a girsa issue on the last line of Gemara. The way this Gemara appears everywhere else is that al tikrei rakasech al rekasech, that it's those who are emptiest, afilu rekonim shabbat malay in mitzvos karimon, and that's the kal v'chomer, that if even they are malay in mitzvos karimon, the or of Gehenna is not going to be sholet them. Hydrol al-chomer l'kodesh stiklo l'sech chagiga. Hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'lishrim nach Seder Moed, V'losisn Sheminon, Lo Ba'al Adein, Lo Ba'al Da'asi. Hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'lishrim nach Seder Moed, V'losisn Sheminon, Lo Ba'al Adein, Lo Ba'al Da'asi. Hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'hydrol Seder Moed, V'hydrol Chalon, V'lishrim nach Seder Moed, V'losisn Sheminon, Lo Ba'al Adein, Lo Ba'al Da'asi. Yirzel Ufnech Adonai Elohim V'Elohei Avseinu Shetei Saroskum Naselu V'Olmazeh V'Seidim Anu V'Olmazeh Chaninu Bar Papa, Rami Bar Papa, Nachman Bar Papa, Achoy Bar Papa, B'Mari Bar Papa, Rafan Bar Papa, Rachish Bar Papa, Surcha Bar Papa, Adu Bar Papa, Dor Bar Papa. Harev Na Adonai Elohim V'Sibris Saroskum V'Finu V'Fiyos Amcha B'Yisrael V'Nia Kulanu Anachnu V'Tzatzei V'Tzatzei Amcha B'Yisrael Kulanu Yodei Shemrecha V'Log Yisrael Sefer Me'oivei Techakmeni Mitzvosecha K'Yolam Yili Yihili B'Yisam B'Chukecha L'Mad Lo'Yevosh Lo'olam Lo'eshkach V'B'Dech V'Kivam V'Yisari Baruch Atah Adonai L'Amnei Chukecha Amen Amen Sal V'Ed Moed Menachnu V'Fnech Adonai Elohim V'Lo Yavseinu Shesamcha Chokenim Yosh V'Beis HaLevish Lo Samcha Chokenim Yosh V'Kronos Sha'anu Mashkim V'Heim Mashkim Anu Mashkim V'Divrei Torah V'Heim Mashkim V'Dvar B'Tenu Anu Amelin V'Heim Amelin Anu Amelin L'Kabel Sachar V'Heim Amelin V'Heim L'Kabel Sachar Anu Ratzin V'Heim Ratzin Anu Ratzin L'Chayel Mabal V'Heim Ratzin L'Ver Shachas Shenema B'Atal L'Him Toridei L'Ver Shachas Anshi Dam Mirba L'Yachs Yimeim V'Ani Yaftach Bav Yiratzon L'Fnech Adonai L'Hai Kishem Shazraton L'Sayim Seder Moed Keit HaZer L'Haskus Norim Svar B'Chevim L'Saimon L'Limud L'Lamed Lishma L'Vasos L'Kayim L'Kol B'Misal L'Torsecha B'Yava L'Zchus Kol HaTanoim V'Amoraim L'Samidei Chachamim Yam Godel Zarevish L'Kom Shator M'Dinu V'Yizareim V'Zer Zarei Adoma V'Yiskayim V'Anu V'Yisalech V'Tatfa Asaf V'Shach V'Tishma Alech V'V'Ktzos Yisik Checha Kivir V'Yalech V'Yosipol Chashnoskayim Orch Yavim V'Yimino V'Smol Osher V'Chavod Adonai Oz Yam V'Yitein Adonai Moed Salam Shalom Yiskanal Yiskanah Shmei Rabbi Yom V'Vasu Yischadasu Yachel V'Asay Yasach V'Yasu L'Chai Yom V'Bekar V'Yushlai V'Shachol Ha'Echol V'Gabeh U'La'kol V'Chol V'Chol V'Na'ara U'La'asav V'Chol V'Yishmai V'Asrei Yam V'Tutsh V'Rich U'V'Mok V'Sei V'Korei V'Chai Echol V'Yamechol V'Chai V'Chol V'Yis Yisrael V'Adon Zman Grim Amen Yishadar v'Yishalad v'Yishalal Shmei D'Chutzah B'Ruchu Le'elim Kol D'Chasa V'Shirasa Tushbechasa V'Nechamasa Ta'amir V'Yamav V'Imramen Al Yisrael V'Al Rabbanan V'Al Talmideinu V'Al Kol Talmidei Salmideyon V'Al Kol Man Da'askin B'Araisa V'Varsa Hadein D'V'Chol Asar V'Asar Yehelon V'Chol Shlomo Rabba Chinu V'Chista V'Rachmin V'Chayim Arichun V'Zon V'Vichei V'Furkanim V'Fadmabuan Yishmai V'Aravim Ramen Yishlo V'Ravim Yishamai V'Chayim Tov Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imramen V'Aseh Shalom V'Mamav V'Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imramen
Mazel tov to everyone on such a wonderful and beautiful simcha. We could ask everyone to please find their seats for our concluding portion of the program. Thank you so much. As today's simcha is as much about completing Seder Moed as it is about beginning Seder Nashim, we turn now to one of our beloved Rosh Yeshiva here in YU, someone whose erudition in Torah and Halacha is certainly renowned, an author of numerous Svarim, in both Lamdas and in particular on topics Bein Adam L'Chaveiro. A Rosh Yeshiva here at YU and a rabbi in Teaneck at Or Saadia. Please give your attention to Harav Daniel Feldman.
And Rabbi Glasser, Shos, Rebbe, Rosh Yeshiva, and Rabbi Blau, Tzibor. When this program was being discussed a few months ago, the joke was made that this part of the program sounds like it's sponsored by YU Connects, an introduction to Nashim. Of course, in reality, no actual women will be introduced, but even in concept, it's a little bit misleading, because Seder Nashim is not really about women in the individual sense, but rather in the sense of Keres Habayis, in the sense of Ishto Zobeso. The whole Seder is really not about females, but about families. And it gives us a picture of what the Torah has in mind for a family structure. And if we look briefly at the various Masechtas in Seder Nashim, so we see how that message comes across. So we'll start with a few comments about Masechtas Yevamos. I'd like to take this opportunity to dedicate these comments, as was first for Refuah Shlema from my father, who hasn't been so well the past few months, and to his writings has done much to teach about the importance and the significance of Masechtas Yevamos. Masechtas Yevamos begins with a list of relationships, which is appropriate, because the Masechta is really about what it means to be related. The Masechta is primarily named after the mitzvah, the Torah of Yibum, which addresses a situation where you have a man who, Rahman al-Islam, passes away without any children, but he has a brother. So the brother is obligated to marry the widow, to marry his sister-in-law, in the hope that they will have a child who can carry on the name of the deceased husband. And right off the bat, so we have two different aspects of being related that are in conflict with each other. On the one hand, the sister-in-law, the widow, and the brother-in-law are really relating to each other. That's an erva, they're not supposed to be married. But on the other hand, there's another relationship that's involved, and that's the relationship between the two brothers. The relationship one brother has to his deceased brother, and the obligation he has to him. And Chassam Sofer writes in his Kedusha B'Chumash, in the Torah's Moshe, the Parshas Kiseitze, that this mitzvah comes to show us the great importance of Gemilas Chasadim, of being there to give, to help to those who are, especially those who are closest to us, and therefore the Torah embeds in the very concept of erva, the very concept of Giliarayos, an exclusion when there is this primary chesed taking place, apparently it becomes permitted. So we have this obligation to be there on behalf of a relative, and it's such a powerful obligation. The Gemara tells us there's a concept, it's a debated concept called the zika, that there is already a relationship between the widow and the brother-in-law. It's a whole discussion in the Afronim exactly what the relationship is based on. Yosef Endel and his Asman Reis and others discuss this, different models. Is it the idea that the original marriage continues into the brother, or is it that the brother and the sister-in-law have a new marriage that's created by the mitzvah, or is it something in between? Whatever it is, there is some existing relationship already between the two, where Yibum essentially would be a formality then to bring them together. And if that doesn't happen, then the woman is prohibited to anyone else, unless there is the alternative of chalitza. There is this ritual, which is also a commitment to the Torah, and also discussed in the Masechtas Yevamos, to allow the woman to marry somebody else. So one might come to the conclusion that chalitza is only a matter, is only something that's there in order to allow the woman to marry another person. But the Achronim debated this, and the only Yantif has a tshuva in Siman Kufay Vav where he rejects this idea, and he assumes that it's not simply a matter, but it's a mitzvah, that there is a chiyuv. Even if the woman is not interested in marrying anyone else, there has to be either yibum or chalitza, but one of them has to take place. And the Maran Shik has a tshuva. The Maran Shik was one of the great students of some Sofers. He has a tshuva in Arachayim and Siman Kufay Gimel, where he discusses how this package, yibum and chalitza, transmits a very important message in the value system of the Torah. That on the one hand, he says there are three parts to this message. First of all, on the one hand, there is the notion that the most primal desire that a person has is to pass on the Masorah, to pass on the tradition to a future generation. Then, secondly, if one is deprived of that opportunity, if one dies without any children, so then his closest relatives, his brother, those who are closest to him, have an obligation to step in and to help in any way that they can, to be there in the most personal way to provide assistance to this deceased brother. And third, that this must be done only for completely pure motives, only with a complete attitude of lishma, and that's why we find the notion in Masechet Sivanos as well, on Daf Lamed Tes, that intent is much more important than it is by other concepts. In general, we have a machlokas, whether we say mitzvos, shritos, kavan, or not. But when it comes to Yibum, so Abba Shalom is quoted as saying that if one would get involved in Yibum for anything other than the purest of motives, then it's close to being Gili Arayis, it goes back to the Avera status, it doesn't have the mitzvah at all. Which is why nowadays we don't really see Yibum so much, especially in Ashkenazi circles, that we assume we don't have proper intent, we don't have the purity of motive. Chalitza is involved more commonly instead. But the notion is there that it has to be either Yibum or Chalitza in order to convey the importance of these messages, as the Maharan Shik points out. He goes on to suggest that these messages together are really the legacy of Avraham Avinu, the legacy that he gave to his descendants, because the Pasuk says in Parshas Lech Lecha that after Avraham rescues his nephew Lot, so the king of stone offers him a reward, and Avraham says, I'm not interested in any reward. I'm not interested in anything, not in a thread, not in a shoelace. And the Medrash, the Gemara has a different comment on this, but the Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah and elsewhere says that the reward for this statement, that Avraham says he's not interested in even a shoe strap, is that his descendants have the mitzvah of chalitza, which involves a shoe, they have the mitzvah of yibum and chalitza. That's the reward for this statement. So what's the connection? What does one have to do with the other? So Maharan Shik says, here you see this attitude, that Avraham says, I'm here to rescue my nephew, I'm here for my family, I'll do anything for my relatives, I don't want any reward, that's all I'm thinking about, I'm here for that purpose. That's the attitude that's passed down to his descendants. So the Gemara tells us as well in the Masechet Sivanos and Daf Ayin Tes that if you want to know who's a descendant of Avraham Avinu, so you look to see who has a quality of being a Gomel Chesed, who has other things as well, but who has this attribute of being kind and giving to those closest especially, and also to everyone else. That's an indication that they're a descendant of Avraham Avinu. And throughout the Masechta, we find many different reflections of this idea of identity, of caring for someone in a way that is very personal, especially when you're related to the person, of feeling this complete sense of identity and connectedness, including in the relationship of marriage. The Gemara tells us on Daf Samach Beis that the way one is obligated to love one's wife, Ohe Vesishto Kigufo, that he should love his wife as himself, Umachabda Yosemi Gufo, and he should respect his wife even more than he respects himself. So one could ask, okay, so you should love her as yourself, why do you have to respect her more? It should be enough to respect her as yourself. And it seems that the idea is that men and women have different needs when it talks about respect, and you want to consider how to be treated. So there are differences between men and women. If the husband's going to think that, okay, I'll respect my wife the same way that I want to be respected, so there's a good chance he's aiming too low. It's a good chance that he's not really going to get it. So if he aims a little bit higher, if he has in mind that I'll think of what I want and I'll go a little bit beyond that, so then maybe there's a good chance that he'll respect her on the appropriate level. But at the core, it's an identity idea that he should love his wife the same way he loves himself, and that's again a theme that we find throughout the Masechet Sivanos, that that's what relationship is about. So the halachas of Geirus are also in the Masechet Sivanos from Daf Mem Hey on, and the Gemara tells us if you want to join the family of Klal Yisrael, you want to become a Jew. That means become a part of the family and identify completely with the Torah of the Jewish people and the history of the Jewish people, and pass that on to the next generation. So the halachas of Puruvu are also in the Masechet Sivanos and Daf Samach Beis. We have this theme throughout of identity and relationship, and not only with people, but also with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is one of the major themes as well. And so we find in the first Gemara is about Yibum, that the backdrop is the halacha called Aseh Lo Talos Aseh. That if there's a clash between a positive mitzvah and a negative mitzvah, under some circumstances, the positive mitzvah takes priority. And the Ramban writes in his commentary to Chumash that this has to do with two different components of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. On the one hand, we have an obligation of Avos Hashem, that we love God, and we show that through doing positive mitzvahs. On the other hand, we have an obligation of Yiras Hashem. We revere God, and we show that by abstaining from negative mitzvahs. So if there's a conflict, if we have to choose one, so Avos Hashem is often going to take priority over Yiras Hashem, but it's a balance. We have to figure out exactly how to keep the two in balance. And we find other concerns as well about the relationship towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara tells us in Daf Chav in Yevamos, Shmarti v'Shmarti, as we Shmeres v'Shmarti, that we have an obligation to protect our relationship with the Torah and with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu through safeguards, through Takanas Chazal, that the rabbis are given the authority to protect the Torah with extra offenses, with extra rules, so much so that the Gemara says later on Daf Tzadi that Yeshkar B'Chachavim L'Achadavim and Torah Yishkashei B'Altaseh, that Chazal have the authority when necessary to protect the Torah, to even contradict the Torah, so to speak, to say, for example, we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. If it's Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, we don't blow shofar. There's a famous essay by Rachanan Wasserman trying to figure out exactly what this is about. And one of his possibilities is that when Chazal make this rule, it essentially rewrites the halacha, and now there's no longer a mitzvah to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah if it happens to be Shabbos. That the efforts to protect the Torah become a part of the Torah itself, and this is all geared towards protecting our relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the mitzvahs ben Adam L'Chavero that we find as well in the Sefer Sivamis also all go to this principle of unity and identity. So, for example, at the end of the first paragraph of Yivamis in Daf Yud, so there is a discussion of prohibition of Los Dovidu. It's a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, which the Gemara interprets a little bit differently to tell us that we can't have divergent halachic practices within one geographical area. You can't have visible halachic differences. This is one of the primary issues coming up. Chol Moed and Tefillin, the one big discussion about the prohibition of Los Dovidu. So Rashi writes over there that the concern is it shouldn't look like two Torahs. It shouldn't look like we follow two different religions. But the Rambam in Hilchos Zara and Perek Beis, the Rambam and Sefer Achinuch and others understand that it's about machlokes. And we're afraid that we're going to have fights. If we have division in practice, people are going to fight with each other. We wouldn't want that to happen. That would undermine the unity of Klal Yisrael. And this machlokes leads the posting to discuss, and Siyum and many others have truths about whether this prohibition applies to minhagim. When it comes to a minute, so maybe we're not concerned about the appearance of two Torahs. But as far as machlokes, as we know, there are many machlokes that can come from minhagim, from anything. So we have to worry about that even in regards to a minute, in order to protect the unity of Klal Yisrael. Gemara and Daf Samachay also talks about the concept of tochacha, about rebuke. And rebuke, we have a complicated attitude, because on the one hand, the Torah tells us we have a mitzvah to try to set somebody straight if he's doing the wrong thing. But on the other hand, the Gemara also tells us that we're not so good at it nowadays. We don't know how to do it effectively. And both of those are two different halves of the coin of the identity idea. As the Rambam points out in Hilchos Darius, in Perek Vav Zayin, that tochacha comes from a sense of identification. It comes from the fact that you feel so connected to someone else that you feel responsible for what they do. But that also has to come across in how you say it. It shouldn't look like I'm yelling at you, but it looks like I care so much. I'm the same as you, so therefore what happens to you is going to happen to me as well. And nowadays we're not so good at transmitting the message that way. We're not so connected to the identity principle, so it gets lost. So we have a problem doing tochacha properly nowadays. But again, it comes back to the identity principle. And to give another example from Masechta, also on Daf Samachay, the Gemara says that it's mutter of shanos b'fnei Hashem, it's even a mitzvah, it's a machlokes in the Gemara, that it's permissible or even obligatory to stretch the truth in an instance of shalom to preserve harmony. There's a whole discussion as to what exactly that's based on. Is it based on a redefinition of what emes and sheker means, or is it because the priority of shalom, as the Ramah writes in his Shuvas, it's in the Yud Aleph, and then Achronim wrote after that shalom is such a priority, it outweighs many other mitzvos. And some explain it's based on the idea the Medrash has. The pasuk says in the Tehillim, "Baki shalom v'radfeinu," we have to chase after shalom. So the Medrash says when it comes to mitzvahs, we don't find you have to chase after a mitzvah. If the opportunity is here, so you're obligated. If it's not, we don't find you have to become obligated. But when it comes to shalom, you have to chase after it. And then the Achronim explain that we can't do all the mitzvahs ourselves, but we're part of Klal Yisrael. So we're part of an entity that's doing all the mitzvahs. So we're all related. We're all connected. So all the mitzvahs are happening on our behalf. But that's assuming that there's shalom. That's assuming that we're all together in one entity. So therefore, Baki Shalom or failure, that becomes an obligation that we have to chase after. That unity is something that we have to hold on to. So Masechet Yevamos directs us to this idea of relationship as identity, as absolute connection, and telling us the fact that we have to manifest that in how we behave towards each other. And then we get into the Kesubos. Kesubos takes it to the next level. Kesubos tells us that not only are we related, but we also try to create a household. We try to create a larger entity. So Masechet Kesubos deals largely. Yeshiva has discussed the word Masechet Kesubos this year. That Kesubos talks about the obligation specifically between the husband and wife, focusing primarily on the obligation of Kesuba, that the husband has to accept an obligation towards his wife at the time of marriage, of all the things he's going to provide on her behalf. And it's a machlokes in the Gemara throughout Masechet Kesubos, and we've shown him as well, whether this is an obligation in HaTorah. Tosfos and Daf Yod quotes with any time that the Kesubah that we have today is an obligation in HaTorah. Most of the other Rishonim understood that really it's an obligation midrabanan. It seems to be at somewhere in between. It's clear that it's based on the Torah, and that Chazal expanded on the idea. It seems to be shot in the Rambam, that the Rambam throughout the Torah accepts the view that Kesubah is drabanan. But when he formulates the mitzvah of marriage and Sefer mitzvahs, he includes Kesubah apparently as part of the mitzvah in HaTorah. It seems that we have a continuum, that there is a core obligation in HaTorah of how spouses are supposed to treat each other. Chazal gave more details to that and fleshed that out with a little bit more of a severity to it for a couple of purposes. The Gemara says Chazal did this, that a man shouldn't be too quick to divorce his wife, he shouldn't be casual about that. Instead, it should be a serious relationship, and that relationship should have substance. It's how we create a household, that there are reciprocal obligations. Everyone has a part to play, not only within the family, but in the larger community as well. And that's why we find also in the Masechet Kesubos many of the details of the stalkers. The Gemara in Daf Samach Zayin talks about the obligation of Deimach Sorah, we have an obligation of the stalker to be there for someone who has a financial downfall, who's not able to support themselves at the level that they were once accustomed to. We have to try to get them back. Even when it's just an emotional need, it's not really a material need, we still have to be there for them. The Ramah writes the other day, it's been raised that it's such an overwhelming obligation. It can't be a personal obligation, it must be a communal obligation. The community together has to look out for these individuals, and at the same time we have to keep it in balance. So the Gemara says earlier in Kesubos and Daf Nun, the Chazal made a takana that we shouldn't give too much stock away, we shouldn't give away more than a fifth, because we might become impoverished and we won't be able to support ourselves. To keep everything in balance, we have to know how much stock to give and how much to hold back. And that theme of balance is really what Masechet Nedarim is about. Masechet Nedarim talks about the concept of undertaking a commitment. If you say something, so that becomes binding. That tells you something that you can't do or be connected with, or something that you're obligated to do. And even if you don't say it, even if it's just a hanhaga tova, if it's a good practice you take on, that also becomes binding. So in fact, the founder of Daf Yomi, Meir Shapiro, in his Shuvas or HaMeir, has a shuv about whether or not Daf Yomi has the status of a neder. If one learns Daf Yomi, maybe that should also be an obligation that one should continue to do. And it sounds like in general the Dharma are good things, that it's an aspiration, that it shows you're trying to hold yourself to a higher standard. And that seems like it's something good. But the Gemara has an ambivalent attitude. The Gemara tells us that something good. But the Gemara has an ambivalent attitude. The Gemara tells us that if somebody takes a neder, it's as if he built a bama, as if he built a personal bath in his backyard, which is prohibited. And even if he keeps the neder, it's not any better. That's as if he sacrificed on the bama. That's as if he actually brought a korban on this prohibited mizbeach in his backyard. The Rana over there says has to do with the balance of the Torah. The Torah is perfect. You're not supposed to add on to it. Lo dailacha mashas Torah. So just like a bama is an additional thing, it looks good, but it's not really permitted. So to a neder is in the same category. The Maharal says it a little bit differently. The Maharal says that this can cause divisions between people. That even though it's good maybe on a personal level, but it's going to separate the noder from other people. And maybe that's not so good. Just like a bama in your backyard will keep you from having to join the tzibur in the Beis HaMikdash, so too the neder can keep you away from others. And that has a cost, and we have to figure out whether that cost is legitimate or not. Although sometimes it's necessary in order to protect our relationships. And that's how Nozer and Sota end up following Masechet Nedarim. That the first daf in Nozer says that if somebody witnesses a Sota, if somebody sees the trial of an alleged adulteress, so then he should be inspired to take on more commitments, to stay away from intoxicating substances, so he shouldn't come to such types of loose behavior. So sometimes a neder commitment like that is necessary to protect the relationship. So we have to figure out the balance, and that's how Maseches Nedarim ends up, bringing us right back to Tzubas with Perek Naira HaMurasa, which focuses on the fact that if you have, let's say, a married woman or a girl living in her father's house and she wants to take Nedarim, so those Nedarim have an impact on the rest of the family, and the father or the husband has a say in this as well, because the neder is a personal commitment, but it has an impact on the unit that you're a part of, and that's also something that has to be taken into consideration. So with those introductions, so we're almost ready to get married, but not yet. Before we have the Sefes Kedushin, so we have the Sefes Gittin. It seems a little bit funny that the tractate that's about marriage comes after the tractate that's about divorce. Gittin comes first, and the cynical line they say is the Hiktim before Lamaka, that the remedy is given before the illness, and we have Gittin before Kedushin. But in a sense, perhaps it's true. Perhaps there is a message that's being conveyed here. If we want to forestall Kedushin, if we want to make sure that a marriage is going to last, then we first have to be warned. We first have to have a cautionary experience of learning the Sefes Gittin, which tells us about how fragile the relationship is and how the relationship can fall apart, and therefore there is a need to be aware of that. The Gemara says in the last Gittin, right before you go into Kedushin, that Hamagaresh Ishtar Rishona, if someone divorces his first wife, I feel the Mizbeach, Moed of the most, that even the Mizbeach, even the altar cries for him. The Musar explained, the Mizbeach represents sacrifice, and a marriage requires sacrifice. And sometimes if there's a divorce, it's because there was a lack of commitment to sacrifice. It could be other things as well. Maybe it was never meant to be, but at the very least, we know that marriage requires sacrifice. And the Gemara, in essence, is warning us about that before we get involved in the Sefes Kedushin, that we have to know that this is a very fragile structure, and there has to be a proactive attitude towards maintaining harmony. So in the Sefes Gittin, you also find the takanos that are there, Mishum Tikkun Olam, the different measures that are put into place in order to preserve social harmony, in order to make sure people do the right thing. We recognize that sometimes we have to take a proactive measure to make sure that will be protected. And in essence, that perhaps is really the message that the Sefes Gittin is really conveying. And then finally, with all of that introduction, so now we're ready to get married. Now we get to the Sefes Kedushin, which is about the marriage itself, about the act of the marriage, which is represented in halacha by a kinyan, by a transaction. And that's what much of the beginning of Kedushin is about. And it provokes a lot of controversy because people get the impression, okay, so you see in Jewish law, what happens is a man buys his wife and she's like property. That's the kinyan Kedushin. We don't really think that's what it's about. The Rambam explains in Mishnah Torah that really it's a different idea, that the notion is that the Torah wants that if a man and woman are going to have a relationship, so that has to be taken seriously. That has to be done with commitment. That shouldn't be something that's casual. So if a man is interested in a relationship with a woman, he has to first commit. He has to first become related and express seriousness and say that I recognize, I learned all the first Masechtas and Seder, and I understand what this involves, and now I'm ready to commit to you fully and to become related. So we have an expression of seriousness. So we look through halacha. Where do we find seriousness in halacha? With kinyan, with transactions. If somebody wants to buy something, so he has to express seriousness. So we have a whole host of mechanisms called kinyan to express seriousness. So if we're looking to express seriousness in this relationship, so we use that mechanism of the kinyan in order to say that we're serious, that we want this to be a full relationship. And that's what the Sefes Kedushin teaches us as far as how the marriage happens in the first place. And then, when we get to the end, we get to the last half of the last Masechta, the Seder Nashim. So now we finally find out the secret, what everything is all about. So the Gemara tells us on Daf Mem Aleph. So how do you know in the Torah you're obligated to love your wife? How do you know in addition to all of this, most of what we discussed is in Parshas Kiseitze. How do you know in the Torah there's an obligation to love your wife? That's not from Kiseitze. That's from Parshas Kedoshim. It's a very famous pasuk. The Torah says, that famous principle, that same mitzvah, that's the mitzvah that teaches you that you have to love your wife. So on the one hand, it reflects again this identity principle, you have to you should love your wife as yourself, but it's also surprising because that's the same mitzvah that applies to all of us. That's why we have to love everyone. So apparently the Gemara is telling us that that same mitzvah that teaches us how to relate to people, it teaches us how to relate even to those closest to us, even to the most intimate and personal relationship. That's simply a more intense version of the relationship that we all have to each other. It just carries its own more intense obligations, but it's all a reflection of the same identity value ideas. So with that framework, the Gemara a little bit earlier, in the end of the first paragraph, can talk about unique relationships, specific relationships, the mitzvahs, the obligations the father has towards his children, the mitzvahs of kibbud avei, the obligations children have towards their parents, the mitzvahs asay shasman grama, which may also be a reflection of the family structure of the wife and mother. All of this can be discussed in this context This notion of Yahavta, L'Reach Kamocha, teaching us how we have to relate to everyone through the prism of our most personal, our closest relationships that are about this idea of identity. So essentially, with all this, when we know all this, so then we're ready to get married. Then we can call in Vayukinex, and we can introduce actual men to actual women. And we have these principles that Masechet Yevamos tells us that a relationship means identity, and that carries with it very strong obligations of chesed in the purest form. And we have Masechet Ksubis that teaches us about how to build a household and how to build a community. Masechet Seder with Nazar and Sofa, which teach us how to keep our own personal aspirations within the balance of the larger cloud. Giving, which warns us about the fragility of the relationships that we enter into and how they have to be proactively protected. And then Kiddushin, which tells us how to form this most intense personal relationship through the prism of all of that, and with a seriousness that reflects knowing all of that, that becomes the mentality with which we enter into Kiddushin, that most focused relationship, and that should serve as a model for all of our relationships. Yomi is a wonderful program, not only because it allows so much Torah to be studied, not only because it creates Harvest Torah on such a broad level, but it does it in a way that connects us. It does it in a way that emphasizes the relationship of the Jewish people all around the world, that creates this sense of unity in such a powerful way through such a powerful tool. And it's a tremendous list that we have starting today, that we're able now to study the Seder, which is all about how we're meant to relate to each other through the prism of Chazal and of Kadosh Baruch Hu, through the wisdom of the Torah in the purest sense, and in a way that connects us in such a fundamental way. And now we have the bracha of Vayu Torah, which connects us even more, which creates bonds that are even stronger, and all across the world we're learning the daf together. It's a tremendous opportunity, it's a tremendous bracha, and we should only merit to have continued simcha such as this shared together as a family of Moed Torah. Mazel tov.
Okay, now no one has to learn to say your nashim. Good. Which is good because the next Siyum is in Hashem will be June 1st, 2016 for Seder Nashim. Everyone's invited back in Hashem. Hopefully all those who are currently looking for Shidduchim will find even before them. But now they have a sikum of sorts. Just a couple of closing words. Wow. That was certainly a tease for Seder Nashim. But it makes us wish, I think, one of two things. Either that we all knew what Rabbi Feldman seems to know. It also kind of makes us wish for Megillah and Sukkah again. There's an interesting small comic that was in Aretz Sheva that many of you probably seen, with a fellow with a little party hat and all these little Masechtas in front of him, and there's this huge Masechtas Yomi standing behind him, threatening him. It is an interesting change to go into Yomi. Don't be scared off by the first Mishnah and the first couple of Dafim. But it is an interesting change for the Daf Yomi world. We've been used to making a Siyum every month and a half, getting that constant chizuk to move into Yevamos. Rabbi Krohn tells a story of a Baal Bus in Switzerland who goes to his rabbi, and he tells his rabbi that he really needs for his daughter to speak to the rabbi. The girl is very, very anxious, very, very upset. The rabbi agrees, knows the family. The girl has been suffering with cancer for several years. The girl comes to the Rav and tells the Rav something quite astonishing, a shaila he had never gotten before. He said, you know, the last few years, the girl's 15, the last few years when I've been getting my treatments, I've been able to really daven. But now that I'm in remission, I'm finding it very difficult to daven to Ribbono Shel Olam. I don't feel that same intensity. It's really bothering me. The Rav was astonished. That's not the shaila that he usually gets. And trying to explain to her that Avodas Hashem has to be in good times and in bad. And there are different kinds of people. There are people who respond better in times of crisis. That's when they feel closer to the Ribbono Shel Olam. And people who respond better in times of joy. There are, in effect, Jews whose highest moment is on Yom Kippur, and even, I would say, on Tisha B'Av. The phenomenon of so many people connecting to the Rebbeinu Shalom on Tisha B'Av. And there are people who are Sukkot Jews and Purim Jews. But we each have to be able to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the easy times and in the difficult times. We need to be thankful to the Rebbeinu Shalom, joyous with the Rebbeinu Shalom in the easier times and in the happy times. And we need to find a way to connect with Him at times of difficulty. Rabbi Krohn points out that it's interesting that we say the same Kaddish at a graveside and at a sea. Very, very interesting thing. We say the same Kaddish at the graveside and the sea. We don't say Al Rabbanu, but we do say the same thing in both places. And it's interesting. It's a message that in the sad times and in the wonderful times, we say the same tefillah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's very interesting that of all times, they picked a Siyum. A Siyum as an example of a simcha when to connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And he said something, I think, a little bit homiletic, but very, very interesting and a chizuk for us as we go from Perek to Perek and Masechta to Masechta. Rabbosai, a Masechta and Shas is a mashal for life. There are prakim which are longer. There are prakim which are shorter. There are times in our life, there are things that we go through, whether it's a simcha, whether it's a good thing, that lasts for longer and lasts for shorter. There are masechtas. There are masechtas which are mashal for life. We all want to be Masechta Shabbos. Right? With 24 prakim, we all want to have 24 prakim, however long a perek is in our life. Nobody wants to be Masechta Chagiga, that's for sure, it says. But there are longer prakim and there are shorter prakim and longer masechtas and shorter masechtas and masechtas that we find easier and more enjoyable and pieces that we find more difficult, that we struggle through. And that's life. That's what life is about. Not only is Talmud Torah the driving force in our lives, the Talmud Torah, the masechtas that we go through, that is our lives. We have moments of joy, moments of accomplishment, moments of frustration, times when we feel 100%, and times when we struggle through. But our life is mirrored in the masechtas that we learn. So we go sometimes through a time when it's easier, it feels wonderful, and I'm on top of it, and I'm excited, and we go daf by daf, and then sometimes like something else comes up and I fall a daf behind and 2 daf behind, and I have to struggle to get back into it. And then I hit a long sugya of Tum and Tahara, and I'm wondering what the rabbi's talking about. But that's life, I will say. And the trick is to find the Rebbeinu Shalom, both in our wonderful times, in our days of gadlus, as they're called, and in our days of katnus, where we just push through, and we struggle through, even though we don't feel it, but we make it, we do it, we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we find HaKadosh Baruch Hu even in those times. As we move from Masechta to Masechta, from a time of so many siyums, to the harder work of some longer Masechtas, Ritz Hashem, we should feel the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on our shoulder as we're learning the Gemara, as we did through the shorter Masechtas, and sometimes the easier Masechtas, sometimes. In Moed, as we go into the sea of Seder Hashem. I want to thank very much the Center for the Jewish Future, to thank Rabbi Glasser, to thank Yomi, to thank everybody who helped put together this wonderful event, along with Rabbi Isaac Ochanan Theological Seminary, to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank our sponsors. This wonderful Siyum is dedicated in memory of Erwin Eisenberg, Moshe ben Rav Isser, Zichrono Livracha, father of Michelle Berman, grandfather of Reuben and Miriam, Gabi and Tova, Marcella and Aaron Berman, in commemoration of his yahrzeit on Erev Yom Kippur by Michelle and Daniel Berman. Thank you very much. Also, the Seuda that we're about to go into, the refreshments sponsored by Cedar Market and Aaron's Casino Farms. Thank you, everybody. Hatzlacha with Seder Hashem and Git Yosh.